So hi everyone, my name is Kelly Weld and I'm joined today by Nora Lenz, the author of Dog Nutrition 101 and the creator of the No More Vet Bills website. So first, welcome Nora.
Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you for letting me pick your brain today.
Sure thing, anytime.
Yeah. So for those who are unfamiliar with Nora's book, this is just a heads up that this is not just another nutrition book for pets. So be sure to stick around for the entire interview because this truth is powerful and we want the power to be in your hands, not the hands of those that profit from sick pets. So Nora, as far as I know, you're the only person who has authored a book on natural hygiene as it relates to pets. Can you start off by telling everyone how you stumbled across this concept and what is natural hygiene exactly?
Well, I started thinking about changing my own diet in about 1980, probably 1986 or something. And I discovered natural hygiene in about 1990. Natural hygiene is just the science of aligning ourselves with our biological requirements. And it's universal. It applies to all species because all species had to adapt slowly to the environment that they were born into on this planet. And they had to, they made small changes in their bodies and the way they did things and the way they ate and the way they behaved, and their bodies changed as a result of that. And the more that, and that happens over a very long period of time, much, much longer than domestication, for example, in the case of dogs. But the more that we can understand that and that those adaptations were firmly in place by the time civilization came along and by the time we started domesticating dogs, and the more that we can align the way our dogs live and eat with the way dogs would naturally in the wild when left to their own devices, the healthier they'll be. And this is not information that's easily found because there's a huge, gigantic avalanche of pseudo information out there about how to feed dogs, and even the well-meaning people have made it much more complicated and mysterious than it needs to be. It's really not complicated at all. It's the idea that it's complicated has been advanced because it sells products. The manufacturers,
And we like to make things complicated as humans.
yeah, and it becomes a little bit of a hobby to some people. It's kind of mental entertainment to get into the detailed, minutia about dogs and dog physiology and all of that. And you really don't need to know very much. You don't need to know much at all. You just need to follow some very simple instructions and change what's in your dog's bowl every day. It's so simple. It's amazing how simple it is and how powerful and profound the results are when you apply this information. And that's why I wrote that book, and that's why I'm making this video. I just want to get this information into the hands of dog owners who want to be empowered with that information.
How long have you been doing this with dogs and feeding this way?
Well, I've been feeding dogs properly for about 20, 25 years. Experimenting along the way and learning and having experiences with dogs and rehabbing dogs that belong to other people. And there's still a lot more to learn. Unfortunately, we are left to experiment because the professionals that we rely on for information and guidance have been co-opted by industry. Industry has used these frontline health professionals to sell their products. The industry, they are industry reps. That's what they've become. All practitioners, even so-called holistic ones, the ones that are selling products, that is. I mean, there might be a few out there that are saying the things that I'm saying. I'm not aware of them because I don't sell any products at all, none, zero. I don't even recommend any products. We can't we have to experiment. We have to use so-called anecdotal information. We have to learn from the experiences of other people. And it does involve a little bit of, fumbling around in the dark. And then you find something that works.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of that process, that's natural science. That's the way science proceeds. You go in objectively going, what's the answer?
Right.
Not, you don't go into science going, I have this theory and I want to prove it. No, you don't do that at all. You go in, what's the answer? I'm open to all options. And when you do that, and when you experiment on that basis,
Mm-hmm.
then what you end up with at the end is the truth.
Yeah.
And that's what we've done, or as close to it as anybody.
Yeah.
Yes.
What is it that is different about this diet that makes you believe that it is a more natural diet, or it's the right diet, or what are the things that you see? I know in my two dogs, when applying this, I saw the reversal of cancer and chronic allergies and early stage kidney disease. And so it seems like when you put these principles into practice, that you can reverse any disease. Is that true?
Pretty much. It depends on how far it's advanced. And there are cases when the body just doesn't have enough resources left over.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess to answer your original question, the way that I know is experimentation and discovering what works. And also a lot of research has been done on wild dogs. And, when researchers go out and watch wild dogs, they tend to focus on predation. But very often, especially lately, we've been getting lots of information from the research, the wolf, especially the wolf research
The
community.
Voyager wolf, yeah.
The Voyager wolves, yeah, about dogs eating secondary foods and what I regard to be secondary foods for dogs. There's no question in anybody's mind that when a dog has a choice between meat or prey and plant foods like fruit, they're going to eat prey. I mean, there's even a dog with a belly full of meat is going to walk right by fruit and not eat it.
Yeah.
There's no question in anybody's mind about that. But what we haven't understood until recently, and what hasn't really been noted fairly, and I think it's because of a bit of bias going in on the part of researchers, and that's the problem with research in general. But what we've discovered lately is that they eat a lot of secondary foods. There's a lot of gaps in prey availability in the natural setting, and dogs fill it in with the fruits that they can find and pilfer. And they live near orchards, they live near vineyards, believe it or not. Coyotes live near apple trees.
Mm-hmm.
And we see them eating fruit. We see them eating a lot of fruit. We see them going to a lot of trouble to get it. And they're obviously not well adapted to eating it. I mean, it's a whole lot easier for a human to climb an apple tree if, he or she has to get to the apples than it is for a coyote to do it. But we've seen coyotes do that.
Yeah.
It's kind of like when we get really hungry and like we're out in the desert with rabbits, and the only thing we can do is, fashion some trap or try to chase a rabbit down. I mean, when we're clumsy, slow moving humans try to chase a rabbit down, we look a bit like a coyote climbing a fruit tree. It's kind of the same.
Yeah.
That can be used for food for us if we need it, but it's not our first food. Our first food is to reach up and grab the fruit.
Right.
Well, for dogs, their first fruit is chasing the rabbit down. If they have rabbits, they're going to go after the rabbits.
Yeah.
If there's no rabbits around, they're going to eat. They're going to try and get the fruit out of the trees if they can.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think this eating of fruit is doing for the health of these wild animals? It's obviously reducing the amount of meat that they're consuming, making it much less than what an animal, companion animal today would typically consume. So what is it doing exactly that is helping with their overall health and their longevity?
And that's the crux of the issue, because it's not necessarily what they're eating. So it's not that their bodies are suddenly being flooded with nutrients. We love to hear that, because that means all we need to do is add something. We need to add something to the body. We need to add nutrients, and that's important. Yeah, it's important to get nutrients into the body for sure. But what's more important is what you take away. And when you're feeding fruit and all secondary foods, plant foods, you're feeding, you're removing the cause of the vast majority of disease in dogs, and that is the animal fat that is found in all commercial dog foods, all commercial dog foods. And it's this animal fat, and it needs to be explained. I mean, I've explained it a million times, but once again, it's when agricultural animals are fed what they're fed, their bodies store those harmful substances that can't be used and can't be eliminated fast enough in fatty tissues. And those fatty tissues follow the supply line, all the supply chain, all the way down to you. Nobody cuts it off. Nobody gets rid of it. The producer puts it there deliberately by feeding cheap food and deliberately fattening up the animal. I mean, this concept of deliberately fattening an animal for market, it's so taken for granted in our culture. That's just something farmers do. Well, yeah, they just fatten their product up. Well, that's fraud. That's putting something on that animal that wouldn't normally be there.
Right.
It's pathological. It causes pathology in everybody who eats it, humans included, dogs included, cats included. Everybody who eats it gets sick.
Yeah.
But nobody gets rid of it along the supply chain. It gets all the way down to the raw ground, the commercial, raw dog food that you can buy in the store,
right,
or the hamburger or whatever. And you get stuck with it. I mean, if you buy it in the form of a product that can't be, where the fat cannot be removed, your dog's going to be sick.
Yeah.
And that's what happens.
So for, like, if you're a PMR feeder, really there wouldn't be much that you would have to do in order to improve what you're doing currently if you would just substitute some of the days, or extend the days that you're feeding meat so that there's some space in there, whether it's fasting or whether it's a fruit meal, for instance. But to get back to your fat situation, is it just animal fat? Because a lot of people, they'll stick in the coconut oil in these meals, and everybody thinks coconut oil is so great.
It's mostly animal fat, but there's no oil that's good for dogs.
Yeah.
Absolutely no oil. There's no free oil trees in nature. The oils are very taxing on the liver. The dogs have no capacity for digesting oils, and oils, when they're fed with carbohydrates, especially, because people will tend to put coconut oil in with their plant meals and whatnot to make them more appealing for the dogs, or help the skin or the coat or whatever they think it's doing. And it actually coats the carbohydrate and makes it really hard for the body to break down the sugars. So I don't recommend feeding any oils at all. It's mostly animal fat that causes the problem, though.
Yeah. So what about barf feeders? So if you're a PMR feeder, you could pretty much introduce some, additional plant days when you're not feeding meat to help, reduce that toxic burden. But what about barf feeders who are already incorporating plant foods in their meals?
Right. And PMR feeders can do more than just feeding meat only, 2 or 3 times a week instead of every day. They can take steps to remove animal fat from the diet. And PMR feeders, there's a lot of PMR feeders out there, and for those who don't know, it stands for Prey Model Raw, that will just rave and rave about how PMR cured this or that in their dog. And it's absolutely true, because what you've done is, once again, you've removed the cause of the problem. What the dog was eating before caused the disease. And PMR represents enough of an improvement that the body was able to catch up on its eliminated backlog and solve whatever problem that was causing the disease.
Right.
So, but it's not, it just doesn't go far enough. And what people discover when they're doing PMR is that there's this, PMR has this reputation of being the absolute best way you can feed your dog. So when people still continue to have problems with their dogs on PMR, they think, they go to genetics, they blame genetics, or they blame vaccinosis. And it's not like those things aren't legitimate problems. But when you go in assuming that those are the cause of the issue, then the only thing you can do is just manage it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
That's
start
just
incorporating supplements like turmeric paste and all of these things.
right. And those things are so popular in
Yeah.
the PMR. And that just shows you that PMR isn't the be all end all, because there's so much supplement and remedy use in that community. But so that's, another thing that the PMR feeders can do. But the bar feeders also, they might actually be on the right track or closer to it, I think, than PMR, maybe at least the same. But the problem with bar feeders is they tend to overcomplicate meals. They put supplements and oils typically in with the meals. They follow this completely crazy, arcane, complicated, complex, these menu plans that are put forth by some of the holistic vets that have made names for themselves, by aligning themselves with, natural home feeding, alternatives. And they also mix every food that a dog could possibly need in his lifetime in one bowl and expect the dog to be able to digest that all at once. And it just complicates digestion. But, the body wants one food at a time, basically. When a dog eats rabbit, yeah, he's going to eat a little bit of stomach contents. When wolves have actually been shown out in the wild as shaking the stomach contents loose before they eat the internal organs of a large ungulate like an elk or a deer. Because there's been for a long time, there's been this theory that we need to make sure that they get their pre-digested, pureed vegetables or vegetable matter along with their meat meal, because that represents the stomach contents. Well, suddenly, the researchers watch the dogs take the stomach out of the body, shake the contents loose, and then eat the tissue of the stomach itself. And, what does that say? Well, okay, in a rabbit, it might be unavoidable. And it's a little tiny thing. And maybe that's why dogs eat grass. We don't really know why dogs eat grass. Every dog seems to eat grass. Lots of dogs do. But anyway, that's what's wrong with bar feeding. It's just everything in the bowl at the same time. And what we need to do basically is get rid of the non-foods, get rid of the supplements, get rid of the remedies, get rid of the this or that, the turmeric, the oils, all of that, and feed just simple plant foods that a dog might be observed eating in the wild, that a discerning dog might eat very, all by itself. Like we do feed certain plant foods that we've never seen a dog in the wild eat. We've never seen a dog eat cooked yams in the wild. But what we know about cooked yams is that a discerning dog will pass up a raw yam, but will readily eat a cooked yam. And, you have to wonder why. Some nutrition has been lost in the cooking, but also what happens is that the starches had been converted into simple sugars in the cooking process. And that's why they taste, cooked yams taste sweeter to us. And they also taste sweeter to dogs. Dogs have not very sensitive taste buds, but they do have taste buds.
Yeah.
And go ahead, sorry.
I was just going to say about the bar feeding, and mixing everything together, there's a telltale sign that something is wrong when you're doing this, and that is gas. Every dog, I watch a lot of dogs, and most of them are bar-fed dogs, and my dogs don't have gas anymore. But when those dogs come over, the first thing I notice is how gassy they are.
Yes, absolutely. And it's because those foods, whatever goes into the stomach that's miscombined with another food, and the other food, gets digested, but the food that's incompatible, and who knows which one it might be, that's up to the body. The one that doesn't get digested, it's going to ferment, or it's going to putrefy. I mean, proteins putrefy and carbohydrates ferment. Well, when that process happened, that just means that the bacteria is eating the food instead of you. I mean, instead of your dog. And when bacteria eat, they're just little critters. They have gaseous waste products, and their gaseous waste products produce this, gas that comes out, or bloating that a dog might feel. And that's why a dog might not feel so good after meal times. If you observe lethargy, sometimes in a dog, dogs hide their symptoms. A dog can be bloated. When you feel bloated, when we feel bloated, we like to just lay around and go, oh, I feel bloated. Dogs don't generally do that. They're up for a walk or whatever. But anyway, yes, that's a very common symptom of barf feeding, and it's just miscombining. It's inescapable. It might still happen when you start feeding properly, because if you feed meat one day and then you feed plant foods the next day, meat moves very slowly, depending on how big the meat meal was. Meat moves very slowly through the digestive tract. And if there's still remnants of it there that the body's working on by the next morning, when you want to feed your dog fruit or whatever, the fruit might get held up. And if it gets held up, it's going to sit in the stomach and it's going to ferment. And that's going to, it's not going to sit in the stomach. It's probably going to sit farther down, but it's going to produce these gaseous waste products. So you might see some of that initially. And there are things people can do. They can make the meat meals smaller. They can feed supplemental enzymes temporarily during transition with the meat meal to make it break down a little easier for the body. You should see those symptoms go away. You can delay the plant meal the next day so that the body has a little more time. You can do a fast day the day after a meat meal, and a lot of people do that to just allow the body to enough time that it needs to get the meat meal all the way out. And your telltale sign is the poops. The poops change dramatically from meat days to plant days. Meat days, you'll see little tiny, compact, sometimes dry poops that are super easy to clean up. And the day, maybe even the same day that you feed a plant meal, the poops are going to be big and voluminous. It doesn't mean your dog hasn't taken in what they ate. They obviously took in some of it, because less comes out than what went in. But just by the nature of the food, the fiber soaking up the water is going to produce these large bowel movements. So,
speaking of rotating meals, you coined a new phrase that describes this way of feeding. What is that?
Well, for the lack of something cuter and more gimmickier, I just called it rotational monofeeding, because that's the only thing that I could think of that, even though it's a mouthful, that
I
could
think it's
explain
catching on. I
what
think
we're
it's
doing.
catching on.
I hope so.
Yeah, I mean, I've noticed people using it on Instagram and stuff. So for our Instagram viewers out there, you can do hashtag rotational monofeeding and find people who are actually doing this to see what it looks like. Speaking of which, what does it look like? What would a day of feeding, or week of feeding your dogs like this look like?
Good question. Well, it's not necessarily on a week kind of basis. You can do any kind of rotation, but it's basically separating meat days from plant days. You feed meats on certain days, and you feed plants on other days. And the plants can be fruits or cooked yams, and we do feed quinoa, which is a high protein seed that's well tolerated by dogs, and most discerning dogs will eat it by itself. I tested it out on my dog to see if it was appealing to her, and my dog is discerning. She doesn't eat everything. So just as a side note on the quinoa, but so that is a plant food. It does, I think it adds a bit of protein to the diet that might be missing if you're only feeding protein, say, once a week or once couple times a month or whatever, and people are doing that. But in the book, I describe lots of different protocols. You can choose to feed meat every other day, if that's what, and it mostly depends on somebody's mindset, their own personal philosophies about what dogs need. You know, everybody comes into this with their head full of stuff,
Mm-hmm.
information about what they think dogs need. And this represents a huge departure to some people. To some people, it's the light at the end of the tunnel. I mean, it's just like the pot of gold. Some people go, oh, this is great, I'm going to do this, I'm going to feed, you know, like the 7-to-1 a 7-to-1 plant to meat rotation would mean 7 days of plants and 1 day of meat, and then you start the whole thing all over again. 6-to-1, 5-to-1, 2-to-1, whatever you want to do. You can throw a fasting day or two in there, you can skip the fasting day. It's absolutely customizable.
What are some things, because I noticed it in my own dogs and being part of your Facebook support group, which, by the way, for those listening, is called Healing Diet for Dogs and Cats. It's a great support group for the information in the book. Um, but what are some things that you can expect to notice in your pets when you start feeding properly? Like, one of the things I can think of off the top of my head was an increase in having to go to the bathroom.
Yeah, and it's an adjustment for the dog. It's an adjustment for the owner. This is a big topic, because it sort of gets into puppies versus adult dogs. If the house training is already in place, it's no problem. It's just you have to give your dog more opportunities to potty, especially on plant days. When a dog's alone all day, you know, you might have to go to putting them in a confined area until they adjust. I know I tried feeding my puppy when she was growing up. I tried feeding her plant foods when she was very little, before the house training was in place. And it was almost like the potty, the urge to potty surprised her, and she didn't really know what to do in order to get outside. She wasn't really clear on that she needed to go outside. And she's a Cocker Spaniels, and they're notoriously hard to house train to begin with. So I had to feed her nothing but PMR, Prey Model Raw, for the first year, and just to make her poops predictable and get the house training in place. And then once she was a year old, we started incorporating plants, and now she's 2.5 and she's 100%. No more accidents at all, and she's adjusted. But it does take some time. It takes some patience. And there's lots of other changes that you'll see too. Some of them positive, most of them, I mean, a lot of them positive, but also some negative, because substances that have been harming your dog are still stored in the body. And when you start feeding properly, it allows the body to go in and get those things out of there and send them out via the normal elimination, the primary channels of elimination, which are the bowels and the bladder. But if the body has been using these secondary avenues, like the skin, like the eyes, like the ears, and, you know, the spaces between the pads and whatnot, it may continue to use those. And so you will see a continuation of the symptoms for a while. They will get better. And like you've seen in your dog, I believe, cyclically, if you saw allergies, so-called allergies, at certain times of the year, you might see those when that, you know, time of year comes back again. But the severity will be less, and it might take several cycles of that process until the dog is no longer has any sensitivity at all to these so-called environmental allergens. The, you know, the solution is not to think that you have to keep your dog away from natural, you know, substances in the environment, like grass and pollen. It's
Yeah.
crazy.
No, nor is it to use something that would suppress that process of
Right.
elimination.
Exactly. What you want to do is you want to find out what's causing it. And it's a toxic body. It's just a toxic body.
Mm-hmm.
And but those things, those toxins need to come out. And you've heard this analogy a million times about lemon juice. When these substances contact tissues in the body, they create irritation. And it's like any substance that creates this, or that triggers a hypersensitivity in a body. It depends on the toxicity of the body in question. And the analogy that I use is like, if you imagine pouring lemon juice over healthy tissue, it won't hurt at all. But if you imagine like a cut or an open sore or something, and pouring lemon juice into it, it really hurts. And that's basically the difference between, healthy and toxic.
Yeah.
And that's really the fundamental cause of all allergies. And it's 100% scam and fraud to have people doing allergy testing and avoidance and lifelong management and steroid use and monthly injections and all of this product
Yeah.
selling, profit mongering, toxifying
Right.
nonsense. It's
I
so
mean, if there's
harmful.
just one thing to take away from any of this, it's that um, we need to stop fearing symptoms.
Yes,
Symptoms are the cure, and we need to
yes,
stop fearing them and trying to get rid of them because they're actually
yes,
helpful to us
yes,
and to our
absolutely.
dogs. Yeah.
Symptoms mean the body is struggling in some way, and you don't help your body if it's struggling by adding to its burden. You
Right.
remove its burden. And the way you do that is you fast a dog, you fast yourself, you eat lightly, you feed your dog lightly. You don't give drugs. Drugs don't ease the burden. Drugs suppress the symptom. That's
Yeah.
all they do. They add to the burden and they suppress the symptom.
Sadly, so many people are more comfortable giving or injecting a toxin than they are fasting, even for 24 hours, their
I know,
pet.
and yes, exactly. We don't consider the former, injecting toxins into an animal, abuse.
Right.
But there are people out in the
Yeah.
world, and it's fewer and fewer every day, fortunately, who
Mm-hmm.
will see not feeding a dog for a day or several days as abuse. And
Yeah.
that's not to say that a dog that gets put on a chain somewhere and not fed for a month isn't abuse. That's a 100% abuse.
Yeah.
When we fast our dogs, we supervise. We make sure that they can't get into anything that they shouldn't be eating. We make sure that they get lots of clean, fresh water. We know what we're doing. We understand why we're doing it and all of the dynamics involved and what's going on in the body. It's an extremely caring and responsible and conscientious and loving thing to do for your
Yeah.
dog. Absolutely. It's upside down. I mean, everything's
Mm-hmm.
just, the more
It
you
is.
learn, the more you find out that
Exactly.
everything's upside down.
And there's a lot of research that shows the benefits in humans, and I would argue that dogs are even more biologically equipped to fast for longer periods than even humans. And there are
Exactly.
plenty of evidence where it's supporting fasting in humans for good health.
Right, because their food is so dense. They don't
Mm-hmm.
need to eat much. I mean, look at cats. They eat and then they lay around and sleep because the food is so dense that they need to, they need to that energy for
Yeah.
digesting.
Yeah. Um, a lot of people might think watching this, like, I have a meat and potatoes dog. How am I ever going to get my dog to eat fruit? I have a friend whose dog I watch on occasion. The only fruit he has ever eaten is watermelon, and that's taken some time. But there are some dogs that are just they just refuse to eat. Why is that? And what can people do to encourage their dogs to accept fruit as
Yeah,
a meal?
that's a really common complaint because a lot of people, they have their dog on commercial dog food or whatever, and they do offer them fruit now and then, just occasionally. Um, and the dog's going to reject it, of course, because their belly's full of commercial dog food. And even if the dog is hungry, if the dog hasn't eaten all day, they might still not eat fruit. Even if the dog is not eaten for a couple of days, they might not eat fruit because they have generally a conditioned expectation of getting meat. And that's just like, if a wolf is living in rabbit territory and they eat rabbits every day, and they have never had the experience of not eating rabbit in a single day, they're going to walk by an apple orchard and not even look at it. You know, they're not going to eat fruit. They're going to think, oh, okay, I'll just get a rabbit tomorrow. There's just none around. You know, maybe there's a rabbit party going on somewhere. I don't know, but they're just not going to eat fruit. And it's that conditioned expectation that's causing the problem. So what you need to do is you need to randomize the feeding, and you do that by initially offering these plant foods that are generally appealing to most dogs. And we do have a few little cheat strategies that we can use to get dogs that are really reluctant, really resistant to eating fruit. But I've never seen a dog reject cooked yams and quinoa together. My dog eats it readily. That's what
Mine
she
love
eats
it.
most days. So I would say offer that. If that doesn't work, then you cook the quinoa in a little chicken broth. That might help, and it's disguising the food a little bit, which I'm not in favor of, but it's better than going back to commercial dog food or whatever. You just have to get them being a little more, expanding their mind, expanding their horizons a bit, dietarily speaking, and sort of replicating the situation in the wild that might occasion a dog to eat secondary foods. And that situation is prey scarcity. You have to get across to the dog, we have a little prey scarcity going on here. Yeah. So you're going to have to get used to secondary foods. They're not being stubborn. They're not punishing you. Yeah. You just have to replicate their biological norm. And that's what it is, you know. Secondary foods are eaten secondarily. Only, and we wouldn't have to do that if we had access to wild meats. We don't. I mean, even people who do have access to wild meats, their dogs are generally overfed because they're under-exercised, you know, and all domestic dogs are under-exercised. They just can't, you know, a dog in the wild is going to have to run 50 miles to get fed, or 40 miles, or even 10 miles, or whatever. What domestic dog runs 20 miles a day or 10 miles a day or whatever? Right. You know, hardly any.
They don't have to work for their food.
Right. They don't want to have to work for their food. They don't have to look for their food. So even PMR feeders that can feed wild meats are probably still guilty of overfeeding. So secondary foods can still benefit even if you have access, if you're lucky enough to have access to wild meats.
Feeding these plant meals that are very simple, even if it's just a single ingredient, which I like to do a lot, called mono feeding, you know, just feeding a mono meal of just watermelon, for instance, and they love it. But we are so, we've been so, I don't know, brainwashed, and you alluded to this earlier about having to balance our meals, you know. It has to include all of these things, and it needs to be balanced. Can you talk about that a little bit, and why that's not a thing?
So yeah, we'll get to that next time. The balance thing is another huge can of worms.
Okay.
We need to open.
All right. Well, just want to thank you, Nora. Thanks for joining me today. And I just want to conclude by saying to our viewers out there that I think this is why, Nora, you devote so much of your time to helping people understand these concepts so that they can take back their power, take it back from those who profit from our pet's disease, and enjoy the freedom that comes with knowing about the truth about disease. And that's one of the things that I've really enjoyed in learning about natural hygiene and this rotational monofeeding, is just the sheer freedom from all of that noise and nonsense.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kelly. It's been a great chat. Thank you very much.
Okay. You're welcome. Okay. Talk to you soon.
Okay. Bye.